what many of us have really been waiting for ever since he first agreed to come. I get the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker tonight, Richard Louv. Richard Louv has been critiquing sprawl since before CNU started and before Joel Garreau wrote his book on Edge City. As a journalist, he began looking at and studying the world of sprawl, the world of gated communities, the sort of quasi-private governments that people were willingly subscribing to, in a book that he called, to describe this different new form of development, America 2. It came out in 1983, and I remember, as a young architecture professor, reading it. It was a game changer. It made me, I was thinking about, as an architecture professor, we were focused on polishing the top of the pyramid of the best possible buildings. You know, how do we teach students to make every building perfect? And here was someone who was kind of saying, maybe the problem lies more in how do we lift the bottom? How do we actually start to imagine change, not by just at the top? He's gone on, it was, I thought, a brilliant sort of expose. Since then, he's continued to author 8 books and continued to investigate the impacts of the design and construction of our built environment, gaining particular fame for his last book, Last Child in the Woods, with its attention to the loss of interaction with nature, which is really the subject of his talk tonight and his newest book, The Nature Principle. He will be signing both books at the reception tonight following his talk. He is co-founder of the Children in Nature Network and has received countless awards, including the Audubon Medal, where he joins previous recipients Rachel Carson, E.O. Wilson, and Jimmy Carter. Pretty good company. Please join me in welcoming Richard Louv to CNU21.
First, I'm really honored to be here, and it's so nice, Ellen, that you remembered America 2. That makes 2 people that remember America 2. I want to thank all of you for everything you've been doing. I mean, I worried a lot about many of the things that you have addressed when I wrote America 2. And when I wrote America 2, it was the same time that Megatrends came out. Anybody remember that? It was a huge hit, huge hit. And I was on the TV every now and then with John Naisbitt, who wrote that. And John Naisbitt used to say, you know, Reagan is riding the horse in the direction the horse is going. And I would say, you know, do we really trust the horse to know the direction to go? And I like John, but he was kind of an apologist for many of the trends that I thought were not going to turn out very well. The rise of walled cities, you know, the privatization of police, the privatization of life, the fragmentation of communities into theme-based communities, the rise of community associations that had the kind of power over people's lives that we would never give a public government. Color your curtain liners, whether or not you can plant a rose bush in front. There were, even in 1984, 83, there were more community associations, this new form of private government, than any other form of public government. And nobody really was looking at that, or very few people were. And I was looking at the Sun Belt. I followed the census to where people were moving, the 1980 census. And it didn't look great out there. I saw the rise of these strange, I kept wondering, what are all those skyscrapers doing outside of the city? I called those the anti-cities then. You can imagine by calling them the anti-cities what I thought of them. Joel Garreau later called them edge cities. So the new urbanists have, I think, brought humanity back to cities, back to suburbs. You're not alone. There are a lot of other people working on those issues. But I am a fan of new urbanism, and I'm grateful for what you're doing. I'm grateful to Andreas Duani for what he has been doing, and to Ellen, and to so many others. Steve Nygren, I don't know if he's here, but his work on Serenbe, and many other places around the country serve as examples that we can have a better future. I want to introduce Krista Bustamante. Krista, would you stand up quickly? Krista works with me. She's on the board. She's quite young and incredibly brilliant. She is on the board of the Children in Nature Network, which is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods, the book that Ellen mentioned. And it is leading or helping lead a movement to reconnect kids to nature, not only in the United States, but in North America and increasingly overseas. And if you want to know more about that, she's the one to talk to afterwards. You can talk to me too. First, I have to explain, I don't do PowerPoint. I hope that doesn't disappoint anybody. I know I'm in the kingdom of PowerPoint here. I have to say I did PowerPoint twice. The first time made all the mistakes, too much information on every slide. So I redid it. I did it again, big group, and I thought, I got this nailed. I was out there clicking away, talking, clicking away, and they were really looking closely at my PowerPoint, so I figured, I've got it. I'm no longer a PowerPoint virgin. And then finally I looked around and realized that my screensaver had gone on, and it was my wife and I on a beach in Mexico, and she looked really good. So I haven't done PowerPoint since. I want to start by talking about my main point here, which is how we view the future, how we talk to our children about the future, and how we talk to ourselves. Not long after Last Child in the Woods came out, I got invited to a high school to speak to a bunch of high school students. I didn't want to do it. I was tired, just back from a trip. Then I started thinking, I wrote this book about connecting kids to nature. It's my own community. I felt guilty, so I went. I thought there would be 20 students. There were 200 students waiting for me. They got extra credit. And, but what was remarkable, to my surprise, they were really listening. I had expected gum smacking and note passing. That happened, but that was the teachers. The students were really paying attention. And I was surprised by that. And I turned to the biology teacher after the students had left, the biology teacher who had invited me, and I said, what was that all about? Why were they paying so much attention? He said, easy answer, Rich. You said something hopeful about the future of the environment. They never hear that. Now, of course, they hear other messages, but that really has been the media message, and also the message from environmentalism, I'm afraid. And I'm an environmentalist, I think. Now, why they were listening, why that happened, I think, is because I was telling them some things that might apply to their lives. I was telling them about the research that had just been emerging, about the impact of the natural world, about experience in that, even if it's just outside your window, even a walk through an urban park. We're not talking about wilderness adventures only. The research that showed just how important nature could be for healthy child development, for mental health, for happiness, for the ability to learn. Believe it or not, high school students are interested in those topics. I also told them that because of climate change, because of all the horrible truths that we're facing, everything in the next 40 years must change. We'll need new kinds of agriculture. It's already happening. We'll need new kinds of neighborhoods. It's already happening. New kinds of energy sources. Of course, it's already happening. We'll need new kinds of workplaces. It's already happening with biophilic design. The workplaces that have been designed with nature woven into them and then kept there. In the building and outside the building, the workers in those buildings are far more productive. Sick time goes down, turnover gets better. Everything gets better when we have more exposure to the natural world, and it doesn't just have to be outside the cities. I'm much more interested, in fact, in nearby nature, in urban nature, than I am in wilderness. As they were leaving, again, I asked that question, and he said, you said something hopeful about the future, and it occurred to me that I had not been saying enough that was hopeful about the future. My own son, who I knew he had the nature gene, I knew he had the fishing gene because when he was 3, this is my younger son, when he was 3, I caught him fishing in the humidifier. He did pretty well. He was in high school then, and he was a real nature kid, and he started saying strange things. You know, Dad, how they sliced off the hills across the lake and they put those cheek-to-jowl mini mansions over there? Cut and fill. The hills are gone, the horizon's gone. Maybe that's nature too. You know, that's made out of wood and things like that, so maybe that's nature. He kept saying things like that, and I said, this is a good discussion. These are excellent questions. But what's going on, Matthew? What's happening? And he said this exact sentence. He said, Dad, when I think of nature being destroyed, it's too painful to think about. It's too painful to think about. So my own son was beginning to create a worldview that would cause him less pain, in which he accepted the destruction of nature at some level. Now, at deep level, he was not accepting that at all. He turned out just okay. He found the only college in America where he could fly fish from campus, Evergreen College in Washington. He became a fly fishing guide. And today, he is an urban kid. He's 25 years old. Both my boys are. The 31-year-old is in L.A., doesn't own a car, lives in L.A., very much an urban kid. The younger boy, Matthew, lives in San Francisco. He's a stand-up comedian and sells a lot of popcorn at a theater. And he's still a nature kid, though. One day he was walking through San Francisco and he got overwhelmed with this need to get his nature fix, to overcome what in the book I call nature deficit disorder, slightly tongue-in-cheek. And so he found a beach. He found a place that he could fish from shore. It turned out that when it warms up, it's a nude beach. And so I just I advised him to be careful with his back cast. The older boy moved to New York City out of college, and I would visit him. And we would go for these long walks in New York City and sometimes, many times in Central Park. We spent one day 5 hours just walking in Central Park. I remember we were standing on this little bridge overlooking the pond there, and we saw a guy come down and catch a bass, you know. And Jason said this remarkable thing. He said, you know, Dad, when I'm in the older neighborhoods of New York City and I'm walking through these neighborhoods and I'm looking up at all the old brick, I get the same feeling that I got when you took me down into the canyon behind our house. You know, we play this out differently. People come from different directions to the natural world, and they end up sometimes in different places, but they never lose contact with what the natural world taught them and teaches them, even in the densest of cities, if they've had that experience, if they're old enough to have had it. The younger kids are now today, the less likely they are to have had that experience. In Last Child in the Woods and then in Nature Principle, The Last Child in the Woods is more about kids. Nature Principle is more about the rest of us. In Last Child in the Woods, I reported on 2 bodies of evidence of information that was just coming out. It's only come together really in the last dozen years or so. First, there's the evidence that there has been this massive disconnect between children and the natural world. In fact, between human beings and the natural world. In San Diego, and this is in cities, I'm not just talking about outside of cities. In San Diego, a survey was done of young people, children, in the inner city of San Diego. 90% never learned how to swim. 94% had never been in a boat. 34% of them had never been to the ocean, had never touched salt water, and they were less than 20 minutes away. That's typical around the country. It's typical in the Rocky Mountains when people can see mountains from their window in the school and have never been to them. Children spend about 53 hours a week plugged into some kind of electronic medium. When is there a time to do much else? There's been a decline in 50% in time spent in nature activities since the 1990s. Independent play, which is associated with nature experience, decreased by 9 hours a week just in a decade. Preschoolers, 89% of the time is spent in sedentary activity. Even outdoors, preschoolers are sedentary 56% of the time. In the UK, fewer than 10% of children said they played outdoors in natural places. In China, which is one of the worst, only 5% of mothers say their children explore nature. Now, I can go on and on with the statistics, but we have to remember that this is new in human experience. For all of human history and prehistory, kids went outside and spent many of their developing years, most of their developing time, either playing or working in the natural world. And within the matter of about 3 decades, we're seeing the virtual disappearance of that. That has consequences. Evolution doesn't happen that fast. Why is it happening? One of the biggest things is fear of strangers. That permeates all of our lives now. It changes our attitude about nature itself. It makes us more scared of nature itself. Now, the truth is that the number of stranger abductions has been going down for about 30 years. Violence toward children outside the home has been going down for years. What's been going up is the 24-hour news cycle. I like to think it's not us print guys, but it's the electronic, it's us too, but all you have to do is watch CNN or Fox and you'll see how they take a handful of terrible crimes against children and they repeat them over and over and over again. That's the very definition of conditioning. We're being conditioned to live in a state of fear. Some people think that's some kind of conspiracy. I don't, because that credits too much institutional intelligence to my profession. But it has the effect of conspiracy. Another is that actually there are real dangers in some neighborhoods. It's pretty tough to get outdoors in the park when there's needles in the park. Competition with electronics, I already mentioned. Over-programming of children's time. And poor design of cities, neighborhoods, homes, schools that prevent kids and all of us from connecting with nature. Now this takes form everything from, the freeway you cannot cross, these endless stucco wastelands that surround my house in San Diego. We get preached at as parents, go out and take your kid for a walk, go out and walk where? What the new urbanism has done is given us someplace to walk to, but not in most neighborhoods. Most of them that have been built in the last 30, 35 years do not have the kind of wisdom in them that new urbanism provides, which makes your job so much more important. It also takes place in, as I mentioned, the rise of private governments, the rise of these community associations. One woman in La Jolla, when the book first came out, said, Rich, my community association recently outlawed chalk drawing on the sidewalks, which, leads to cocaine addiction. I made that last part up. You see these in Florida. A couple years ago, there was a community association that actually tried to outlaw children playing outdoors. I mean, some of this stuff, it just makes your head explode. And you've seen these stories. And they're not that uncommon. The message being given to kids is that nature's in the past, probably doesn't matter anymore. Electronics are the future. And it's probably illicit and possibly even illegal to play outdoors. In some cases, it almost is illegal. We call that the criminalization of natural play. Now, the cost to us, to all of us, to our society of that is staggering. We see the rise of attention deficit disorder, of childhood depression and anxiety disorders. We see the inability of children to experience pleasure and play. Teachers talk about this a lot. They talk about the kids' inability to visualize. One teacher told me she put a television in the front of her classroom and a black cloth in front of it and told her kids to sit in front of the television and tell me what you see. That was her way of getting her kids to visualize. We see that preschoolers are the fastest growing market for antidepressants. Depression will be the second largest killer after heart disease by 2020. We see reduced executive function in children. Executive function is that voice inside your head that says, Rich, maybe it's not a good idea to follow those friends off the cliff. It's your ability to be your own boss, your own executive, to create your own world, to be your boss of it. Study was done recently that repeated a study done in the 1940s of executive function and found that kids today, a 7-year-old has the executive function of a 5-year-old in the 1940s. In other words, we sliced away 2 years of development of executive function, the ability to control yourself, to be your own boss. We've done that very quickly. Childhood obesity, of course. New Urbanism has talked a lot about the need for walkable cities for precisely that reason. I would urge you to look beyond only, I know you're looking beyond only walkable cities, but it's not just the sidewalks. Recently, there has been some studies of the impact of sitting, just sitting. There's a new study out from England that says that many of the same diseases that are associated with smoking show up in people who sit for long hours a day. Kind of makes you nervous, doesn't it? Makes you want to stand up. Some of the same diseases, some of the same heart diseases, some of the same cancers, etc. And it doesn't even matter if you're overweight. I mean, it matters. But they are seeing this same phenomenon in people who are not overweight, but just happen to sit most of the day. And what are we doing to kids? We tell them to sit in chairs, don't move, let's test you some more, let's cancel recess, let's cancel field trips. That's what we're saying. And then let's give you some Ritalin in case you act out. Now, I'm not a radical in Ritalin. Some kids need some kind of medication. Some of your kids are on Ritalin. I don't want to make anybody feel guilty. But could it be that some of the huge increase in the number of kids that are on Ritalin and other stimulants who have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? New York Times reported recently that 1 out of 5 kids, boys, in the United States have been given the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder. And a lot of those boys were on Ritalin and other stimulants. Could that be that has something to do with the fact that we took nature away from them in the first place? There's an ongoing set of studies, the University of Illinois, that show that a kid, and they're looking at the kids in the projects of Chicago, kids walking through trees in an urban park, they see the symptoms of attention deficit disorder go down dramatically, even kids as young as 5 years old. Could the fact that we took that away from them have something to do with the huge rise? Some schools, 30% of the boys are on some kind of stimulant like Ritalin. There's a new phrase that I'm really promoting that somebody else's and I always credit, but it's sitting is the new smoking. And what are we doing to these kids? The good news is that a lot of research came out also. Finally, the people who study human behavior, human development, child development, has started looking at the impact of the natural world. There's a lot of reasons, I believe, that this hasn't been done. One of them has to do with where does the research money come from? What pill can you sell for natural play, natural experience? But these studies are impressive, like the attention deficit disorder studies. Studies of cognition, of ability to learn, go way up with just a little bit of contact with nature. Studies of adults, too, young adults. Recent study at the University of Kansas, kids, young people going out for backpacking for 3 days. It seems to peak, effect seems to peak at 3 days. They tested them for cognitive skills and for creativity at the beginning and at the end, and it peaked at 3 days. They came back, quote, significantly better at many cognitive skills and 50% better at creativity in the way they tested these things. And they factored out just the impact, the good impact of exercise. Adults in indoor gyms, on treadmills, compared to other adults burning the same number of calories but doing it outdoors in green exercise. The adults who are on treadmills indoors get healthier. Blood pressure gets better, psychological well-being gets better. But the people who are doing exercise outdoors and burning the exact same amount of energy get even better. There's a margin of improvement we don't fully understand. There are theories about this. I'm sure you've heard some of these. E.O. Wilson, biophilia hypothesis, which holds that we are hardwired to have an affiliation, positive affiliation to the rest of nature. We're part of it, to the rest of nature. And then when we don't get that, we don't do so well. I think when you look at the cognitive skills, my theory is that it might have something to do with the full use of the senses. Other than a New York subway, when do you use all of your senses at the same time as you do when you're outdoors in nature? Scientists who study the human senses no longer talk about 5 senses. They talk about conservatively 10 senses. And some of them talk about as many as 30 senses. Most of the day, our kids and ourselves, we sit in front of computers, in front of screens, and we do our best to block out as many senses as we can. So we can focus on the internet, believing we can go and experience anything in the world through that screen. But meanwhile, we're blocking out all that. You know, to me, that is the definition of being less alive. Do any parents really want their kids to be less alive? Do we want ourselves to be less alive? Now, there's a lot of progress that's happened in the last few years. Children Nature Network has registered over 100 regional, state, and provincial campaigns in North America. These are very large campaigns. Some of them, one happened in the first one of the first city ones was in Cincinnati. They called it Leave No Child Inside Cincinnati. Then they thought about that for a while. And they put a comma in there. In 2009, those regional campaigns are big ones. They went from getting 1 million kids outdoors to 3 million in 2011. It's still not enough. Family nature clubs are catching on. These are multiple families that agree to show up at the park on Saturday and go for a hike. There's perceived safety in numbers. We can't just dwell in nostalgia. We have to figure out new ways for families to get their kids and themselves outdoors. These family nature clubs are working. Some of them have hundreds of families as members. This started a few years ago. A young father of 2 kids and a preschool teacher emailed me, said they'd been inspired by Last Child. They started getting their kids out to the park on Saturdays and their family. One day the 5-year-old says, "Dad, how come we're the only family having this much fun?" He started inviting other families, the father and the mother did. Today they have over 800 families as members of their family nature club, and it's simple. They arrange for several families at a time to show up at the park and do it together. The kids are off running. They're doing what kids have done for millennia, hide and seek. You know, they're playing independently. In my own city of San Diego, I just learned that the Family Nature Club there has over 900 families, and they're broken down into neighborhood family nature clubs. They go out and experience the nature within their own neighborhood, even if they're in a dense urban neighborhood. That's happening. Pediatricians are beginning to pay attention. In 2010, I was asked to give the keynote speech to the American Academy of Pediatrics. This was a big deal. I was very nervous. If there's anybody that can get the parents, it's pediatricians. Get their trust. My wife is a nurse practitioner, so she prepared me for this. She took my face in her hands and said, Rich, pediatricians are different from other doctors. They're really nice people. So I led with that in the speech, and they liked that. But I said two things. And I would say kind of the same thing to you. Here's what I'm not going to ask you to do. I'm not going to ask you to have an official policy on nature deficit disorder, which, by the way, is not a known medical diagnosis. I've said that time after time. It is, though, a shorthand way to talk about something we felt was going on for a long time and had no language to describe it. So I'm not going to ask the American Academy of Pediatrics to have an official policy. What I am going to ask them, I said to them, to the doctors, I'm going to ask you to use your own individual wisdom and judgment to take care of your kids the way you think is best. And if that means prescribing nature, then please do it. Got a great response, much better than I thought. Must have been that lead-in. Today, there are pediatricians around the country that are prescribing nature, that sometimes are called park prescriptions. In Portland, the Portland Urban Park District, Portland, Oregon, is working with local physicians who write recommendations to families to go get some green exercise. When they get home, the Urban Park District calls them, says, here's what we can do for you. Show up at the park on Saturday, and we'll help you get your green exercise. They go to the park. The park rangers now acting as park health paraprofessionals, role they really like, help the families get their green exercise, sign off on it, goes back to the pediatricians. Over time, they're going to study the effect of this. Now, in terms of the shape and the realities of cities, this is where, of course, you come in. You come in on all these other things too, like pediatricians, engaging them as allies. And by the way, these regional campaigns and the rise of these family nature clubs, they can be great allies for you, for new urbanism. They can be a new constituency. I was asked to give the keynote a few months ago to the very first White House conference on environmental education. One of the things I said, and this was 150 environmental educators who had just seen their federal budget cut by $35 million. One of the things I said, as I got up this morning, I was thinking about the movie Jaws. Remember that scene when the guys on the boat say they first realize just how big that shark is that they're up against, and one of them says, we need a bigger boat? So I said that to the environmental educators. I would say the same thing to you. We need a bigger boat. You need a bigger constituency. That's not going to happen if you're only talking, in acronyms, or to each other, or to other people who are interested in the very interesting, and I am interested in it, details of urban design. It won't happen if you're only talking to policymakers or even professors. It will happen if you build a constituency out there that cares about something even bigger. I can tell you that there is a utility to this issue of children and nature. First, there's the issue of itself, which is so important, as well as in adults and nature. But then there's this utility, the practical utility of it. I've seen that issue get people into the same room, to the same table, who do not want to be in the same room, over and over and over again. It doesn't seem to matter what somebody's politics or religion is. They all want to tell me about the treehouse they had when they were kids, if they're old enough to have had that. One of the first emails I got after the last child came out was from the biggest privately owned residential development company in the country. And he said that he had just finished reading Last Child, and he was profoundly disturbed by it. Now, as a kid, I had such a sense of ownership of my woods that I pulled out, I think, hundreds of survey stakes that I knew had something to do with the bulldozers. I think I held them. Remember they made great swords? I think I held them off for a while. By the way, a developer told me a few years ago I would have been a lot more effective if I'd simply moved the stakes around. Anyhow, I did that, so I wasn't profoundly disturbed that the developer of the stucco wastelands was profoundly disturbed by my book. But here's what he said: I want to do something about it. So he invited me to Phoenix to a group of about 80 developers and real estate folks, asked me to give my sermonette. I did. I prepared to run. Then he did something remarkable. He said, I want you to go on to small tables and I want you to solve the problem. How are we going to build developments in the future to actually connect people to nature? They went into their small tables. They did kind of what you helped them do sometimes, I think. They started talking. The room filled with noise, happy noise. Now think about that. These were developers. Happy noise. And they came back, they started reporting some of their ideas, like, maybe we should leave a little bit of natural land in the first place. Good place to start. Maybe we could have trails going through the natural land to the surrounding schools, and the kids could serve like crossing guards, except they'd be nature guides with their cell phones. And maybe we could have a nature center on the property, and then we could market all that as amenities. And I said, great, do it. That's wonderful. It didn't matter what the quality of the ideas were, and some of them were pretty good. What mattered is they had them. If that can happen in a room of developers, it can happen lots of places. I've seen that happen again and again. Conservationists sit down with developers, sit down with pediatricians, sit down with educators, sit down with business, nonprofits, and they don't want to be the last generation in which this is considered normal and expected for kids just to go out and dig a hole in the backyard or build a tree house, or lie on their back and watch the leaves move. Nobody wants to be in that last generation. It brings people together. If you use that as a doorway, people will come through that doorway, and they will sit down and they will begin to see their neighborhoods differently. They'll be able to see their cities differently. I think that you have a huge opportunity now to take the next step. I was reading an interview with Andreas a couple nights ago. It's a recent one. He talks about the 4 stages of the new urbanism. I won't go through the 4th, but he was hinting at the 5th, that it had something to do with environmentalism. I agree with that. I agree with all the stages. I think the next step is the same page that I would hope I'm on to. I think we need a new nature movement. Environmentalism is in trouble. I talked to a lot of college students. Some students at DePaul University invited me to lunch. These were environmental studies students. They had drunk the Kool-Aid. They cared about the environment, but they were depressed. Some of them talked about how they had gone to some of the big environmental organizations, their local meetings, and tried to join up, and they looked around, they said everybody's old, and in fact they're right. The average age, and this is the biggest environmental organization, or one of them, in the country, I won't tell you which one, I don't like to embarrass them. The average age is 67 years old at their membership. The average new member is 64. I think the old members get together and they haze the new members. A young woman sitting there, she's a very hip young woman, I know that because she had tattoos. She said this amazing sentence. She said, I'm 20 years old. All my life, I've been told it's too late. All my life, I've been told it's too late. And I thought, my God, she's right, 20 years. Most of us in this room had a few decades to have an idea that just maybe life would get better. But all her life, she's been told it's too late. And again, she's been told different. She's gotten some good news too. But I think that is the media meme. That is the dominant message. All my life I've been told it's too late. Think what it's like to be a 14-year-old today, growing up surrounded by adults who shrug and say, oh, we tried to make life better in the 60s, that didn't work out, did it? Surrounded by people who say it's too late. New Urbanism said it's not too late. You're saying it's not too late now. I think it's not too late to expand New Urbanism to that fifth stage, to a new nature movement, one that includes traditional environmentalism and sustainability, but takes the next steps. That includes people not necessarily thought of as environmentalists, like pediatricians, like art teachers, yeah, like architects, like urban planners, who to some degree are considered environmentalists sometimes. All kinds of people out there, all kinds of jobs are waiting to be created to connect people to nature for their health, their mental health, their physical health, their ability to learn, their ability to be fully human. We need to create a new kind of city. As of 2008, more people in the world, as you know, live in cities than in the countryside. Huge moment in human history, largely unremarked. We went through that in the US around the 1940s. Now it's the whole world. That means one of two things. It means either that whatever fragile connection the human race has to the natural world will disappear even more as we continue to urbanize, or it means the beginning of a new kind of city. And that is something that you started a long time ago. The next step, I think, is to reunite nature and people in cities. I think that cities can become engines of biodiversity. Two examples. What if the New Urbanism, the CNU, sponsored a national effort to create a homegrown national park? What if it wasn't just me planting, which my wife and I did, native plants in our backyard to bring back the food chain, to make a beautiful backyard? What if it was my next door neighbor, one over there, one over there, one over there? A guy who wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, Doug Ptolemy, is very eloquent on this. This is his phrase. And then what if that happened to the next city and the next city? In other words, private land being dedicated to wildlife corridors to bring back the food chain, which begins with plants, insects, and then the rest. What if we went national with that? You don't have to wait for Congress. You don't have to wait for an act of Congress. We can do it now. We can start now to create a homegrown national park. It can begin in the inner city and spread from there, and it will make life better for everyone. Think of the power that kids will feel if they are handed seeds and seedlings from the Natural History Museum, from the Botanical Park, from architects to reclaim their city for biodiversity. Second example, and I end with this. I visited William McDonough's office recently. He'd been a hero of mine for a long time. I was speaking in Charlotte. His business partner, whose name I can't ever remember, who's German, was in the audience, grabbed me, said, we're going to see McDonough tomorrow. I did. Spent the whole morning there. He's great. Many of you have met him, I'm sure. He's the guru of recycling. The German told me, these chairs in here, they're made out of edible material. And the German said, and this would be very handy if you went down in the Andes, if they were in airplanes. McDonough and I talked for quite a while, and he had this great take on things. He said, here's what environmentalism has been saying to people. And let me precede this by saying, no one can take anything away from the environmental movement. I'm old enough to remember lakes that were on fire when I was in high school and were still on fire when I got out of college. I can remember those places that are now great fisheries. I can remember a time when my father thought nothing about throwing beer cans and trash out the car window as we went down the road. It just didn't occur to people. That's changed. Environmentalism conservatism has changed a lot, but now it faces huge, bigger problems than litter, for instance, or even the pollution of water. The three problems are climate change, the crash of biodiversity, and the disconnect between children and nature. So I'm talking to McDonough, and he said, you know, here's what environmentalism is saying to people when they talk to them about their carbon footprint. You know, your carbon footprint's too big. Yours is too big. Your carbon footprint is way too big. He says what we're doing when we're pointing the finger like that and saying that to people in that way over and over again, we're saying, you know, we'd be better off without you. We'd be better off without you and you and you. That's no way to sell something, an idea. That's not convincing. He has a different metaphor. He says, what if, in terms of footprints, everywhere we stepped, we left a wetlands in our footprint? We were walking around his office, and I looked over at a table, and there was this beautiful drawing, big architectural drawing on the table. And it caught my eye and my imagination. I went over and I looked at it. It's a hospital that he's working on in Spain. It's multi-story, 3 sides. One side is a green wall. One side is top to bottom solar panels done in the colors of a butterfly that is about to go extinct in that bioregion. And then the third wall is a vertical farm to feed the people in the hospital. Now, studies have been shown that people who have a view of a natural scene literally get well better. They don't need as many pain meds. So here's an example that this building is not only saving energy, it's not only about sustainability in the sense of energy efficiency. You know, McDonough likes to say, do you really want a sustainable marriage? Don't you want something better than that? This building goes beyond that. It's saving energy, and now it's producing human energy. That's the new nature movement. But it doesn't stop there. The bottom floor, all glassed in, anybody who walks into that building, butterflies will light on them. The same butterfly that's about to go extinct in that bioregion. They're going to make a community ritual out of this. Open the doors every so often, let the butterflies out into the community. They're not stopping there. They're going to go to every school and say, you can do this too. Every other business, you can do this too. Every place of worship, you can do this too. We can bring this butterfly back. So, here is a metaphor. One building can't save the world, but there's a building that is not only saving energy, it's producing human energy in health, intelligence, happiness. But then it's taking the third step. It's giving birth. It's giving life. That's the new nature movement. Conservation is no longer enough. Now we must create nature. That's what we can do with our cities. That's what you can do with the new urbanism. It's not all you do, but it'll help. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Richard will take questions as he signs books.